The more you know who you are and what you want, the less you let things upset you.
Ah, the haunting line from Lost in Translation, spoken by Bill Murray's character.
Exactly. It encapsulates so eloquently the protagonist's struggle with loneliness and trying to find meaning in what seems like an obscure, disorienting world.
Well, I think it's more than that. It isn't just about the protagonist's loneliness. It speaks to a collective human experience, doesn't it? We've all had those moments where we feel adrift and ask ourselves, what's this all about?
On the dot, Earl. At one time or another, whether we're immersed in a city as bustling and loud as Tokyo, or isolated in the midst of the pandemic, we all have sensed that disconnect from our surroundings or even from others.
From a design perspective, we also see this disconnect mirrored in the surroundings, as if the city itself is an alien landscape. It heightens the loneliness and the introspection that accompanies it.
What's intriguing is how the existential crisis that unfolds within the protagonist is internal, and yet it resonates outward, impacting not just our understanding of the film, but also how we perceive our own feelings of solitude.
That's true, Mia. And the beauty of Lost in Translation lies in its ability to masterfully mirror those emotions. The visuals, setting, colors, all work in tandem to knit the tapestry of isolation that the protagonist grapples with.
Thinking about the psychological perspective to our protagonist's loneliness, it's almost like looking into a mirror reflecting the rawest parts of the human soul.
Absolutely agree. The visual elements also reflect this feeling of solitude. You see Tokyo's vibrant cityscape constantly surrounding our characters, but it's shown in such a way that it heightens their loneliness, not detract from it.
From a psychological standpoint, the film illuminates the paradox that is human interaction. We long for connection but often feel misunderstood or disconnected. This is evident when Bill Murray's character, Bob, is thrust into a foreign culture. Despite being surrounded by people, language barriers and cultural differences accentuate his solitude.
That's really interesting, Mia. Speaking of paradoxes, Coppola makes use of the vibrant cityscape to mirror this stark loneliness. It's the small details in the frame that convey solitude: empty seats on a subway train, a single pillow on a large bed. These aren't glaring, but subconsciously build towards the uncanny feeling of being alone in a crowd.
Right, Earl. Let's delve a bit more into Bob's coping mechanisms. Temporarily trapped in Tokyo for his work, Bob grapples with insomnia, a common result of his disconnect with his surroundings. It's a vicious cycle where his isolation amplifies his insomnia, further pushing him into a state of solitude. Do you think the design aspect reflects this cycle as well, Earl?
Absolutely. Sophia often places objects such as phones and walls between characters, indicating physical and emotional distance. The repeated night scenes, neon hues, all tie back to Bob's insomnia and isolation. So both visually and narratively, the film continually echoes the protagonist's deep sense of loneliness.
Comparing Bob's experiences with real-life scenarios, many of us might feel lonely while traveling alone, especially in a foreign country. In Lost in Translation, this loneliness is further amplified due to cultural and language barriers. It's almost like Sophia is forcing us to ask ourselves, do we feel lonely because we are truly alone or because we feel misunderstood?
That's an intriguing thought, Mia. Comparing this with the film's design, Sophia symbolizes these clashes of cultural norms and the disorientation caused by unfamiliar surroundings through contrasting visual elements. She fills the screen with crowd scenes or bustling cityscapes, only to place Bob in the foreground, looking lost and detached.
Yes, all of us might have felt like an outsider at one point or another. Earl, in your perspective, how does Sophia's specific use of color and space reflect this loneliness?
Well, Sophia beautifully aligns the color palette with the protagonist's mood. I remember Bob's character mostly inhabiting dimly lit enclosed spaces, a hotel room, a nightclub, a taxi. Low light, a predominant feature in all these scenes, suggests his mental state. Aimless, gloomy. It's minimal yet impactful.
I see. So the placement of characters, the strategic use of color and space work in harmony to echo Bob's loneliness. It's fascinating how Sophia manages to evoke a deep sense of empathy within the viewers, making us reflect on our own experiences of isolation. Recent studies in the field of psychology point to a strong link between loneliness and physical spaces. Often the design and tone of our surroundings can affect our perception of solitude. What do you think of that, Earl?
Absolutely agree, Mia. In filmmaking, one may observe directors like Yasujiro Ozu often use spaces to reflect the characters' emotional states. Look at Sophia's work here. You can see similarities. Her use of expansive cityscapes and cramped interiors juxtaposed against the character's solitary journey, her palette of muted blues and greys. It's profoundly minimalistic.
Exactly, Earl. And perhaps this minimalist technique is what makes Lost in Translation so relatable. The sensation of loneliness doesn't always stem from the absence of people around us. Sometimes it arises from our inability to connect with them, despite their presence. Sophia carefully crafts this aspect of loneliness, visualized through Bob and Charlotte navigating crowded spaces, but failing to connect.
That's true. This visual element reinforces the film's thematic concerns effectively. As with other minimalist directors like Jim Jarmusch or Richard Linklater, Sophia also relies on her muted color palette to visually portray the melancholic undertone. Keeping the scenes minimal and quiet directly reflects the characters' isolated and muted emotions.
So, from the perspective of a graphic designer, does this muted color palette have more of an impact in portraying melancholy than, say, a brighter palette? How does that affect the viewer's reception of the film's themes?
Well, Mia, the color palette in films doesn't function merely in a decorative sense, but also has a psychological impact. A film with brighter, louder colors can sometimes make emotions feel forced or exaggerated. Lost in Translation disregards cliches and embraces a minimal, soft palette to understate the protagonist's emotional states, thereby making the emotions feel more real and nuanced. It's very insightful of Sophia, really.
Earl, talking about their loneliness naturally gravitates us towards another key element in this film, the feeling of disconnection and existential crisis of our protagonists, Bob and Charlotte. I see some clear psychology at play.
Before you dive deep in there, can you explain what you mean by existential crisis, Mia?
Absolutely, Earl. In layman terms, an existential crisis could be seen as asking what the true purpose or meaning of life is. Bob and Charlotte, with all their fame, glory, beautiful hotel, and the luminous backdrop of Tokyo, seem to question their existence and the meaning of their lives amid the seeming abundance.
This makes me recall the scene where both protagonists are seemingly lost in the neon lights of Tokyo, an epitome of modern civilization, yet they feel disconnected. It's similar to how a brightly colored painting can hide a dark theme.
Well placed, Earl. It's interesting how Charlotte, in her quest for self-discovery, engages in photography and writing, often considered solitary activities. It only makes one ponder over the impact of disconnection and isolation on our choices of self-expression.
Yes, and these themes resonate on a visual level as well, Mia. The behavior of the camera, the strategic framing of Bob and Charlotte amidst the buzzing city life, the conscious use of space, all work together to form this visual allegory of seclusion and existential crisis.
But Earl, do you think the representation of existential crisis in Lost in Translation is echoing a wider societal problem, especially now, when we live in a highly globalized world yet feel disconnected at times?
You may be onto something, Mia. Far from being an outlandish notion, it seems that the themes of progressive disconnection and existential crisis portrayed here are increasingly prevalent in our society. Coppa's portrayal might just be a reflection of our times.
You know, I've actually spent considerable time researching the psychological impacts of social isolation and disconnection on humans, as widely depicted in our film today.
Oh, that sounds very intriguing, Mia. We'd love to hear more about that.
Essentially, Loneliness and consistent feelings of disconnection can trigger stress responses. It can cause anxiety, insecurity, and even depression. In Lost in Translation, this plays out in the protagonist's behavior as they grapple with feelings of dissociation.
That could explain why both Charlotte and Bob exhibit a sort of restlessness and dissatisfaction, despite their seemingly comfortable lives.
Yes, and it also magnifies their existential crisis. They question their life's purpose, their relationships. The external isolation deepens the internal one.
Absolutely. From a design perspective, the film uses isolation quite cleverly too. Consider the scenes where Charlotte and Bob are frequently framed within large open spaces, their hotel rooms, the Tokyo cityscape. The negative space intensifies their personal isolation.
That's a fascinating observation, Earl. Quite ingenious, really, how a film's design can visually amplify its psychological themes.
Yes, it's a brilliant example of visual storytelling. And this attention to design detail, in my opinion, greatly enhances the viewer's understanding and appreciation of the film's narrative. Now, when it comes to Lost in Translation, Coppola's aesthetics are heavily draped in minimalism. This isn't just left to viewer interpretation, it's a conscious choice to effectively communicate the narrative.
Exactly, Earl. And I noticed how this ties into the themes of loneliness and disconnection. Disconnection can often be felt when there's nothing happening, when everything's still and sparse, and that's exactly what the design evokes.
It's interesting you say that, Mia. From a design perspective, the principles of minimalism focus on embracing less is more. They prioritize function and simplicity, allowing for only significant elements to stand out. In the film, minimalistic design could be seen in both the architectural aspects and use of color.
That's fascinating, Earl. Can you expand more on the relationship between minimal design and the themes we earlier discussed?
With pleasure, Mia. Visual design is a language that can speak volumes in the absence of words. In Lost in Translation, the use of a pale, washed-out color palette mirrors the feelings of the characters. Bland, dull, lost in their own worlds, even amidst colorful Tokyo. Scenes with less content, emphasis on linear forms, and wide, open spaces all contribute greatly in echoing feelings of loneliness and isolation. Let's move our attention now to the recurring visual elements in Lost in Translation. A perfect illustration of this is Bob's window view at the hotel. Throughout the film, we keep returning to this wide shot of Tokyo's urban sprawl from Bob's hotel room. This static shot perfectly captures both the vastness of the cityscape and the relentless passage of time, contributing significantly to the overall theme of isolation and existential crisis.
What a poignant description, Earl. Interestingly, the concept of windows, especially in psychology, is often symbolically linked to opportunities or possibilities. But in this case, they clearly show a world that the protagonist can observe but struggle to engage with, doesn't it?
Yes, brilliant observation, Mia. And speaking of windows, we can't ignore the role of glass panes in this movie. They're featured prominently in multiple scenes, often creating a physical barrier between our protagonists and the chaotic, colorful Tokyo outside. See, it's these types of decisions, the conscious inclusion of elements like windows and glass panes, that reinforce their disconnection from the surroundings and their own existing lives.
The function of these recurring visual elements is beyond aesthetics, isn't it? To add a psychological perspective to this, these symbols perhaps also act on a subconscious level on the viewers. They might resonate with anyone who has felt distanced or misunderstood at some point in their lives, leading to a deeper emotional connection with the film. Shifting our focus now, we have been discussing the intricate details of Lost in Translation, but I think it's essential to also recognize its significant impact on indie films and, more broadly, on our society. The universal themes of loneliness, disconnection, and existential crisis. the film conveys might not only resonate with individual viewers but also imitate feelings commonly experienced within our society. How do you think the film has influenced indie cinema from a design perspective, Earl?
That's an interesting question, Mia. Lost in Translation quite literally changed the game. Its use of minimalist aesthetics to communicate complex emotional dynamics paved the way for similar filmmaking techniques in modern, independent films. I believe it emboldened filmmakers to say more with less. Essentially, its cultural influence lies in the way it captured the reigning zeitgeist of disconnection and made it visually apparent through calculated design decisions.
I agree that it pioneered the integration of psychological introspection and aesthetics in the portrayal of disconnection. While many modern indie films explore themes of introspection and social isolation, Lost in Translation stands out as it skillfully combined these themes with its striking visual elements. Do you think this innovative approach continues to impact indie filmmaking?
Definitely. Sofia Coppola's unique style continues to serve as an inspiration, encouraging filmmakers to experiment visually while exploring introspective themes. It's a testament to her talent how she created this lasting legacy, shaping indie filmmaking's landscape.
Indeed. But in the grander picture, apart from influencing indie cinema, the film might offer a reflection upon our society. Films like Lost in Translation give us a cinematic lens to view and understand our own experiences of disconnection or existential crisis. In other words, it encourages youth to unmask our indies. What is your take on this?
Interesting viewpoint. Films undoubtedly reflect the society they're born into, and Lost in Translation does this remarkably. The resonant themes and visual treatment echo the contemporary experience of alienation, thus reaching audiences on a visceral level. And as a graphic designer, I appreciate the distinct aesthetic influence it holds within not just indie filmmaking, but beyond into design culture as well.
Sofia Coppola weaved a unique tapestry of emotions and space in Lost in Translation, didn't she, Earl?
Indeed, she did. She inserted elements that were minimal yet profoundly visual, which managed to encapsulate, quite brilliantly, the themes of isolation and existential crisis.
And these themes resonate deeply within the audience, giving rise to the film's influence on indie cinema. Don't you agree?
Absolutely. This film emboldened new filmmakers to explore bold narratives while maintaining minimalist designs. The themes of loneliness and existential crisis, portrayed so strikingly in Lost in Translation, have undeniably shaped the narratives of many indie films today.
A valid point. And from a psychology standpoint, extrapolating such deeply embedded emotions and feelings onto film allows the audience to resonate, and in turn, navigate through their own feelings of loneliness or existential crisis.
Precisely. Lost in Translation, utilizing its compelling storytelling and minimalist aesthetic choices, encouraged filmmakers to integrate these humanistic themes into their works, thus resulting in a more cerebral cinema experience.
It's remarkable how such a film has expanded our interpretations of independent cinema, both through its content and design. Any other films that you think might have been influenced by Lost in Translation?
That's a tricky one. It's hard to pinpoint direct influences, but you can see the pervasive impact of Lost in Translation in a number of indie films dealing with similar themes and aesthetics. One example may be Her by Spike Jonze, with its exploration of disconnection. As we transition into the audience Q&A segment of our show, we'd really appreciate your pointing out aspects of Lost in Translation that resonated with you. Also, if you had any questions or misconceptions about the film's psychological or design aspects, do let us know.
Absolutely, we're eager to hear your perspectives. Let's get started, Earl. What's the first question from our listeners?
So, here's one from Hannah in Seattle, who appreciated the minimalistic design in the film and says, "I felt the loneliness of the characters was amplified by the muted colors. Was this intentional?" What do you think, Mia?
That's a great question, Hannah. From a psychological standpoint, our perception of color can indeed influence our emotional state. So Sofia Coppola's muted color palette, which you observed, could essentially be an ingenious method of making the audience feel and empathize with the character's loneliness. However, what do you say, Earl? Is the use of such a color palette a common choice in aesthetic design?
A very interesting observation, Hannah. Remember, as a graphic designer, colors are one of the vital tools I work with, and yes, in design, we do deliberately use color to evoke specific emotions. In Lost in Translation, Sofia uses a muted color palette, packed with a lot of grays and neutrals, and as you've correctly pointed out, this could very well be helping to reflect the loneliness experienced by the characters.
Our next query comes from Alex in New York, who asks, the film focused on the theme of cultural dislocation. I'm curious how this reflected in the movie's design elements. Earl, any thoughts?
That's a good point, Alex. Apart from the color palette, Coppola has also used space in a very unique way to reflect loneliness and dislocation. For instance, the character's inability to blend in with the crowd, being dwarfed by the massive structures of Tokyo, all amplified the feeling of cultural dislocation. This isolation is further emphasized through distant shots, empty spaces, and at times obscured views that somehow mirror the character's sense of being lost in translation.
That indeed is an intriguing perspective. That's the beauty of indie films, isn't it? They encourage us to interpret and experience them in our unique ways.
Mia, I'm curious about your views on the critical reception of Lost in Translation.
Well, Earl, the reaction was diverse. While most critics lauded its sensitive portrayal of loneliness, some thought it fell short on its narrative elements.
That's true. But do you think the critics who found it lacking in narrative depth missed the fact that Lost in Translation is more about generating an emotional response rather than a typical linear storyline?
Absolutely. Film criticism, like any art form, is subjective, but the film's minimalist storytelling approach was quite intentional. Sofia wasn't necessarily aiming for conventionality.
And let's not forget, the film did fetch her an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay. That got to count for something.
Yes, accolades like those certainly validate a director's vision. What are your thoughts on her win, Earl?
It was well deserved. The screenplay, coupled with the film's design aesthetics, beautifully encapsulates the ennui and disconnection experienced by the protagonists.
Undeniably. Lost in Translation is a nuanced film that evokes a range of emotions, so it's normal to see varied critical reception.
Agreed. Lastly, some critics predicted that Lost in Translation would influence a new wave of indie filmmaking. Has this prediction held true?
In the years since its release, I believe we've seen more indie films embracing minimalism and exploring deeper psychological themes. So yes, to a certain degree, this prediction seems accurate. Earl, how about we discuss some behind-the-scenes trivia next?
Sounds great, Mia. Did you know Sofia Coppola originally wanted another actor for Bill Murray's part?
Wasn't it Kevin Spacey? But Sofia waited a year to get Bill Murray.
Exactly. Coppola admitted in an interview that she didn't even have a plan B if Murray turned down the role. An interesting gambit, don't you think?
Absolutely. It must have been quite the suspense. But moving on, Earl, I'm curious about the hotel scenes. They seem too perfectly executed to be sets.
You're not wrong. All those scenes were actually shot in the Park Hyatt Tokyo Hotel. The filmmakers took advantage of its exquisite spaces to highlight the protagonist's loneliness against a backdrop of luxury.
And wasn't its neon-lit bar actually used for Bill's whiskey commercial shoot scene within the movie?
You're spot on. New York Bar, located on the 52nd floor of the hotel, was indeed used for that scene. You could say the hotel became a character in and of itself.
Wow, that sure adds a layer of depth. Isn't there also a fun fact about the iconic whisper in the ending, Earl?
Indeed. As a lot of fans might know, the whisper between Bob and Charlotte was unscripted. Sofia left it completely up to the actors, and the actual words have remained a well-kept secret.
Such intriguing details definitely add to the film's allure. Any more interesting trivia you'd like to share, Earl?
Oh, there are tons, but I guess we'd need another whole episode for that. I'd say the film's real charm lies not just in what's seen, but in all that's unseen and left unsaid.
Now, if we compare Lost in Translation with other movies directed by Sofia Coppola like The Virgin Suicides or Marie Antoinette, what stands out about this one?
Well, Mia, quite a few things, to be honest. For starters, we see a significant shift from using more vibrant colors and elaborate sets like in Marie Antoinette to a more controlled, minimalist aesthetic in Lost in Translation.
And there's a clear distinction in the themes as well, isn't there? While The Virgin Suicides focused on adolescence and bloom, Lost in Translation delves into the middle-age crisis and the feeling of being culturally displaced.
That's correct, Mia. It's also interesting how Coppola's visual communication has matured over the years. The shots in Lost in Translation use more of the less is more philosophy compared to her earlier films.
Coming to Earl, do you feel that the minimalist aesthetic is more impactful in conveying the film's themes of existential crisis and disconnection?
Definitely. I believe the minimalist design in Lost in Translation is a powerful tool to underline the disconnect between the characters and their surroundings. It's a creative method that better suits this film's story.
What about films from other directors covering similar themes of existential crisis or cultural displacement? Do any stand out to you in comparison to Lost in Translation?
Yes, there have been many films exploring similar themes. Michel Gondry's Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind comes to mind. However, Lost in Translation, I feel, handles these themes with more subtlety and nuance, particularly through its visual design.
Subtlety and nuance. I couldn't agree more. It's safe to say that even among other indies, Sofia's take on loneliness communicated through simplistic design stands out, both visually and thematically. So, Earl, considering the profound impact Lost in Translation has on audiences, from its reflection of cultural loneliness to existential crises, what future discussions can this spark about indie films?
Reflecting on it, Mia, one potential conversation revolves around how indie cinema can continue to take advantage of minimalist aesthetics to delve into deeper psychological issues. Lost in Translation employed this technique to remarkable effect, highlighting the isolation and disconnection experienced by the protagonists. Other filmmakers can certainly draw inspiration from Sofia's method and apply it to explore themes resonating with their audience.
True, Earl. There's also the idea of cultural displacement and the consequent emotional turmoil, mostly swept under the rug in traditional cinema. Future indie projects should continue digging into these themes, not just for the Western audience, but with a global perspective. This approach could make indie films a medium of shared human experience across cultures. Thoughts?
That's a thoughtful insight, Mia. Further, the use of visual symbolism to depict psychological themes also offers a compelling canvas for future indie films. The tactile texture of a fluffy pink carpet or the cold, sterile, neon-lit cityscapes effectively conveyed emotional states in Lost in Translation. Unraveling and analyzing these elements could inspire film designers to imagine more meaningful and emotional narratives.
All valid points, Earl. Our discourse today gives a testament to the depth that indie films have and the various layers of interpretations they offer. Future discussions can and should continue highlighting the psychological undertones of these movies and the impact they have on viewers.